Welcome, friends, to another edition of Face-to-Face Conversation. I'm Tihomir Kukulja, producer and editor of Face-to-Face. Some of you might find our conversation today somewhat challenging, while the others might find it very inspiring. For some of you, it might be confusing. And some of you might say, I'm hearing this for the first time. Whatever the case, stay with us till the end of our program today. There is a very popular belief among many Christians, not all, in the West and especially in the US, that if we are Christians, we need to support Israel. And while this is being done within the same circles of Christians, you can barely hear anything about Palestinian Christians in Palestine and Israel. Either they don't know much about that such Christians do exist, or if they do, as if it doesn't fit a paradigm, their paradigm. And this is why it is a blessing that today we have a group of 5 young Palestinian Christians from Palestine and Israel to share with us some of the challenges they're facing as Christians in Israel and in Palestine. And I'm truly hoping that the time we are all spending now together will help all of us who know something and us maybe who do not know much, to get a better insight into the situation, conditions, and challenges that the Palestinian Christians in Palestine and Israel are facing. Let me this time welcome our panelists. They are Arij Murad, born and raised in Bethlehem. Arij worked for many years as the development and communication coordinator at Bethlehem Bible College. Today, she is a project research consultant on Palestinian matters with Northumbria University in the UK. Then we have with us Shadia Kupti, a Palestinian Christian born and raised in Nazareth. For many years, Shadia has worked as an influential peacemaker in the Middle East. She is the editor of the Women Behind the Wall podcast, and she has worked for a number of years for Musalaha, a very well-known Middle East peace-building and reconciliation ministry. And then we have with us Yusuf El-Houri, born in Gaza. With his family, he lives now in Bethlehem, where he lectures at the Bethlehem Bible College. He's a member of the Christ at the Checkpoint organization and also a member of the Academic Alliance for Interfaith Dialogue in Palestine. Then we welcome Lama Mansour, an Oxford student and active member of her church in Nazareth. And she's a member of Christ at the Checkpoint Conference. And then we have with us Jack Mulayer, a Palestinian Christian living in Jerusalem. He works with the World Council of Churches, and he is the coordinator of the Christ at the Checkpoint Conference. And I believe that it is a proper thing to start with the introduction, to provide some historical context, which is going to lead us then further into our conversation. So, Arij, I would like to ask you to be the first one and give us some historical background to the story that will then develop into the current situation that Palestinian Christians are facing at this time. Please, welcome.
Thank you, Tihomir. The history of the Palestine-Israeli conflict is very complex. I'll try to summarize it as best as I can to give a background about what's going on in the region, what's going on in Israel-Palestine conflict. I'm sharing with you my presentation. One of the biggest myths about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is that it's ancient and it goes back to many centuries ago. But this is not correct. The conflict is less than 100 years ago, not because of 2 different religions clashing together, as some might think, but because of 2 groups of people claimed the same land. On the land that we call as Palestinians historic Palestine, as you can see in the map, lived people from different religious backgrounds that identified themselves as Palestinians, which means, again, that the conflict has never been a religious conflict because Muslims and Christians and Jews live together in the same region without any problem. even during the Ottoman Empire. But that was until religious beliefs became a political agenda. When the Ottoman ruling started to fall, the British mandate seized the area and started allowing big immigration, numbers of Jewish immigration to Palestine, pushing Palestinians out. The British basically were giving away land that wasn't even theirs. So keep in mind that anti-Semitism was not rooted in the Middle East. It was a Western-born initiative that got migrated into Arab lands, starting from Palestine and Jewish immigration to that land, and became a problem for people who were not playing that game. So prior to the Holocaust, Zionist ideologies were forming, basically transforming Judaism into a nationality that needs to have its own country. So Zionists were considering Uganda and Argentina, as you can see in this document, and actually in this document, but they chose Palestine as their destination, supporting with false pretenses as a people without land and a land without people, which caused major tensions between settlers, Jews, and Palestinians, since Palestinians were being pushed out of their land. Then the Holocaust happened, and after the Holocaust massacre, the newly formed UN at that time unfairly divided the land, and that's when everyone started being very encouraged to come to Israel and live in Palestinian land, unfairly divided the land as a solution. As if you look at this map as the UN solution for the division, you can see that there's a huge loss of land for Palestinian, and making it look like a jigsaw puzzle with so many missing pieces. With all this stacked up tension, that adding it to the UN unfair division of the land, it has led to the first war of 1948, which Palestinians lost massively. That's why we call the war al-Nakba, which means a catastrophe in Arabic. Some examples of the catastrophe we still recall to today are the loss of Deir Yassin, where an entire village was wiped out, and Lidda, where 500 people were killed within 30 minutes. Such examples of killings, neighbor Palestinian villages got scared and have left and flee their land and became refugees in other countries, and some of them became refugees in Palestinian land as well, that we still have them till today. Jewish state won the war, pushing borders beyond the UN borders, taking massive parts of Gaza, the West Bank, and especially the western part of Jerusalem as well, which is a big deal since there's so many religions living in the area, and that's a sacred place, and the UN announced it as an international location and does not belong to anyone. So as you look at this map, you can see the progression of loss of land that Palestinians went through. It started with number 1 map on the left, where there's some settlers in Palestine moving into Palestinian land from Europe. And then the other one, which is the UN division. And then the third map is the loss of land in 1948. And then again in 1967, Israelis and the neighbor Arab countries fought another war. It lasted for 6 days, but the results were more loss of land and people. This time, Israel took over the Golan Heights from Syria, the Sinai from Egypt, and as well as all Palestinian land that was left for us, which is the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And that was an ambitious Zionist exemption, killing 40,000 Palestinians, and many souls were lost during that war. So in Camp David Accord, they returned back Sinai to the Egyptians, but they kept every other land that you see on this map. But the Israeli military still had the control over the West Bank, Gaza, and Golan Heights, which means the conflict continued. Settlers started moving into the West Bank this time, into more Palestinian land, even though it's against international law. Settlers were suffocating Palestinian villages, making it much more difficult for any peace agreement. Again, more built-up frustrations has led to the first Intifada. Intifada means uprising in Arabic, and this led to more deaths and more loss of people, but not any solid changes or peace. But trying to achieve peace, Palestinians and Israelis tried to come into an agreement in 1993 with Oslo Accords. Even though the agreement allowed some kind of very minor independence for Palestinians, it didn't come without a cost. The West Bank became, as we know it today, divided into Area A, B, and C. But what does that mean? Looking at the map on the left side of the screen, Area AA is what's marked in red, dark red, and is exclusively administered by the Palestinian National Authority, which is approximately 18% only of the West Bank. And Area B is administered by both Palestinian Authority and Israel, which makes about 22% of the territory, leaving 60% of the West Bank as Area C, which is the white area that you can see on the left side of the map. And it's administered by Israel. Today, Area C contains the Israeli settlements, while as of 2015, Area C was home to 150,000 Palestinians, this setting has made life unbearable and moving between Palestinian cities very difficult. Again, this adds up to more tension and leads to a second intifada, especially after the prime minister at that time in 2000, Sharon, walked into Al-Aqsa, which is the third holy site of Islam, walked into Al-Aqsa with soldiers, and Muslims were very upset about this, and it's considered a desecration of the site, of a holy site. So Israel claims that because of the second intifada, where again there were no peace after this and there's more loss of lives, Israel claimed that because of the second intifada, there was a need to build an approximately 8-meter high wall, as you can see in this picture, a separation wall, and set checkpoints between Palestine and Israel. Building the wall is a violation of international human law, but yet Israel proceeded on building it. But it claims that the wall was built for security reasons, but why was it built on Palestinian land if that's the case? As we see on the picture I'm sharing with you now, the wall, that's where the wall was built, and it's different than the first map I showed you. Like you will see that Israel did not abide by the UN borders that the UN tried to enforce on Israel. But the main reason the wall was built like this is to control resources. The wall has been built around water resources and not allowing Palestinians to get access to water, but also land grab and disposition of Palestinian land, breaking the natural fabric of the society, as you can see, because of the division of the areas and how the wall goes around Palestinian cities. The society became very fragile. But keep in mind that Palestine is not the West Bank only. It's also Gaza Strip as well, which is the red part of the map on the left side that's separated from the West Bank. And which since 2005, Gaza has been under strict blockade. And even I, as a Palestinian, cannot go to Gaza. And actually, I've never been able to go and I've never seen it. So in summary, when we are looking at the structure of Palestine and how the history had become to what we are today, or how we identify ourselves today, we can summarize like the following: that the country is divided into two parts, West Bank and Gaza, and they're not connected in any way that forms a country. The geographical distribution of Area A, B, and C has weakened what's left of the West Bank. The separation wall and checkpoint has suffocated Palestinian lands and restricted movement for Palestinians, denying us our basic human rights. And also, 7 million Palestinian refugees around the world today are still waiting for the right of return. But also, the Jewish-only settlements has encouraged racism and is a lie. That's what I would like to share with you, and I'll keep the rest for the other speakers to highlight more of what's going on today and the challenges and the reality we're living in.
Okay. Thank you, Arish. There is no question that the history of the region has been a challenging one and still continues to be challenging. And this would lead me at this moment to a question about reconciliation and peace building. I'm aware that Palestinian Christians in Israel and Palestine have been involved very much in building peace and reconciliation in the area. I'm aware of the organizations such as Musalaha and also the work of the organization and the ministry Christ at the Checkpoint. And I know there is much more than this. And this is why I would like to hear now Shadia sharing a little bit more, especially about young generations today, emerging leaders, and your movements in attempts to build peace and reconciliation in Israel and Palestine. So, Shadia, share with us something a little bit about those efforts, please.
Thank you, Tihomir, for this opportunity to participate and to be with you today. First, I want to depart from the premise that Palestinian Christians involved in this work are inspired and driven by our biblical mandate to be peacemakers. As Christians, we have a duty to be at peace with those around us. The differences I've experienced are in how we get there, whether it's dialogue groups or peace or problem-solving groups as approaches to peace. Let's cut this, I'll repeat the sentence. The differences I've experienced are in how we get there, be it dialogue or problem-solving groups as approaches to peace. Palestinian Christians have continuously promoted nonviolence means to conflict resolution and have contributed to this school of thought. I will share a list of resources for further reading in case you are interested to know more. I will attempt to highlight three main challenges Palestinian Christians face in peacemaking today. The first one relates to the Christian discourse, and the other two are shared with the general Palestinian peacemakers as well. I would like to use the approach of asking questions that helped me get to my answers, and I hope that you find this approach helpful for you as well. The first one, and I'm sure Yusuf will elaborate more on, is the theological interpretation of what peace is, or what is peacemaking. Is peacemaking limited to peace with God, the vertical, or does it expand to others, the horizontal? Is peace possible in a land destined to conflict? Is our land destined to conflict? Is peace in Israel and Palestine possible? I think many of the answers to these questions will rely heavily on your reading of scripture. Are you an apocalyptic literal or a kingdom is here reader of scripture? Experiencing wholeness, shalom, personally with God informs me that I am created in God's image, and seeing others through that same lens pushes me to extend wholeness to others around me, regardless of their ethnic, religious, cultural, economic, or gender background. If my sister is suffering, it is my mandate to do all that is possible to relieve her suffering so that she can be whole as God created her to be. So if I'm influenced by voices that dehumanize or demonize those suffering, the other, what then is my role? So as Palestinian Christians, we feel this challenge of interpretation. And as a result, we are either silenced or rejected by our own brothers and sisters in Christ. Let me ask you, how many Palestinian Christians' voices have you heard so far? And how come? The second challenge is the Palestinian sense of urgency to achieve peace. I want to give you an example from my previous work in dialogue groups where Israelis and Palestinians come together to build relationships. So when listening to a Palestinian participant share about the difficulty to access water in the summer, where at best they have running water 2 days a week, an Israeli participant wanted to take action to help. So he decided to donate bottles of water to that Palestinian participant. I applauded that participant for their initiative. This example highlights the imbalance of power in this conflict, where one side, the Israelis, are more powerful than the other side, the Palestinians. And this translates that Palestinians experience the conflict on a daily basis, whether it's lack of access to resources like water or electricity, or lack of freedom of movement. They have to cross checkpoints to get to their own, from one city to the other city in their own territory. Or traveling is not possible anytime and anywhere. Or being closed in an actual physical wall. Or denied basic rights, especially at this time where you need quality healthcare. So as a Palestinian, I wanted more from that Israeli participant. I wanted him to address the root cause of the water issue, which is Israel's control of Palestinian access to their own natural resources. I want my suffering to be addressed systematically and not just locally. So we feel now is the time to take action, to address the systemic injustices we are undergoing. We cannot wait any longer. The longer we wait, the longer we suffer. So you see an increase in social justice activism as a means for peace due to this sense of urgency. And the third challenge I want to talk about is the dominance of political peace, or what I got to call a capitalization of peace. As Arish has laid down some of the timeline, you know, I was born in the 80s, a lot of unrest, and the first Intifada happened. The 90s was the closest we got to a peaceful time, which was during Oslo. And then again in 2000, we had cycles of violent bursts, whether it's the siege on Gaza, whether it's the second Intifada, and so on. And the current decade, especially in that sector, most of the decisions have been made unilaterally, highlighted right now by the annexation under the umbrella of a US plan called Peace to Prosperity. If you read this document, you will see it as it is. It's a real estate contract ensuring maximum Palestinian land with minimum Palestinian people. Political peace is failing to reflect what we want. And how can peace be achieved by one side? What kind of peace is that? If this is peace, we don't want it. We want a peace that respects human life. We want a peace that treats everyone equally. And what I find most troubling is, why is a foreign country still deciding our fate? Can you imagine a situation where I, a Palestinian, have the power to vote locally that will impact your status as an American citizen in the US? So why should we accept this kind of decision? And if you look at Palestinian voices, especially of times of heightened violence, they have consistently called for an end of violence and seeking a lasting peace between both sides. This is a legacy I am proud to be part of. Peace belongs to all of us, politicians, civil society, faith communities, and those on the margins. It's not a top-down approach dictated from one sector of society, and it has to offer a positive change agreed upon by both sides. Lastly, I want to end by stressing that peacemaking for us is not just a theoretical question, it's an existential one. We want to live side by side with Israelis, and we acknowledge that both people, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, have deep connections to the land, and we believe this land can be shared. What is needed is the willpower to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadia, for this wonderful presentation. What I would like to hear, maybe in a minute or two, when we come to the second part of this gathering together, is also about some practical activism, because I'm very much aware that all of you are very much practically involved in working in the fields of peacemaking and reconciliation. But at this moment, let us go a step further and talk about something else, about some external problems that are impacting and affecting US Christians in Palestine and Israel. I mentioned at the beginning that many Christians in the West, especially in the USA, are very much in love with Israel and neglecting Christians in Palestine. Tragically, this is, according to my understanding, based on a faulty understanding of the prophecies in the scripture, faulty understanding of the eschatology, and through all of this, a bias is being, sanctified bias is being created, by which one group of Christians or people in your part of the world is being very much admired, while concretely Palestinian Christians are being ignored. I would like to ask you, Yusuf, a question about how is this attitude of the Western Christians, and especially American Christians, affecting, impacting you as Christians in Palestine and Israel? Yusuf, please.
Thank you, Tihamir. It's a pleasure to be here and to give the Palestinian seat on the table, to present and to speak for ourselves and our history. Let me share my presentation with you. And here my topic gonna be is Western Christian support of the Israeli occupation and the harmful attitudes of international Christians. And keep in mind here, I'm equating the Western and the international, because how colonialism and how Western theology being exported to other Christian nations and communities around the world. And of course that also has an impact how those nations developed certain attitudes and views of Palestinians. So to outline my presentation, I would like to start with how it's a little of history, going back into history, building on what Arish already said, the Western Christian colonial superiority, and I will discuss dispensationalism as a form of theology that, of course, supported the occupation of Palestine, or actually founded a biblical justification for the occupation of Palestine. Later I will discuss Christian Zionism and its ideology of delegitimization, silencing, and dehumanization of Palestinian Christians, and what that looks like on reality back then and nowadays. So starting with Western Christian colonial superiority. What I mean by that, I would refer to Edward Said masterpiece in 1978, Orientalism, as the West have represented the people of the East, including Palestinians, as barbaric, uncivilized, and people who are unable to govern themselves. So that gave the colonial powers, which is mostly the British and European power, a justification to colonize other nations and to control their resources and their lands. And of course, this attitude of the West regarding the Palestinian is similar historically, but we have this component of religious and biblical justification of the occupation. Although the Bible was utilized to justify colonialism for centuries, but when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli context, it has a significant impact, as I will demonstrate next. So Arish have said that the history of the occupation goes back to the early 20th century as a political movement, but actually the idea of colonizing Palestine predates the Jewish Zionist movement, started and invented by Christians. For example, Lord Shaftesbury, who was the president of London Society of Promoting Christianity Among Jews, which is known nowadays as CMJ, is a very clear example of Western superiority attitude that does not see and recognize the historical presence of Palestinians. So he says about Palestine and about Judaism or Jewish people to be moving or immigrating to Palestine. He says that there is a country without a nation. And here he talks about Palestine, or referring to Palestine. And God now is, in his wisdom and mercy, directs us as a British church and later politics to a nation without a country, the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see, what you see here is an example of Western colonial attitude that doesn't see the existence of Palestinian. Lord Shaftesbury recognized that there was a Palestinian presence in Palestine. However, it seems that Palestinian people were irrelevant to him compared to the Jewish people, the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I see here, it's very controversial that he bridges a 2,000-year gap connecting the Jewish of Europe to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and later, of course, how Christian Zionists connected Israel of the Old Testament to Israel, the modern state. But what I mean here, that the idea of occupation of Palestine and Zionism is actually originated in Christian minds and theology. And later, Shaftesbury's statement became a slogan for the Zionist movement. Here we see Israel Zangwill, which was the associate of Herzl, the father of Zionism, bringing this statement, a land without people for a people without land, which actually as I've said, originated by Shakespeare. But this theological concept, which translated into political movement and ideology, is also has an impact on British government when it's pro-Palestine under its mandate. So we see here Arthur Balfour, his letter to the government, saying that in Palestine we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. That's a very clear example of how the Western Christian attitude toward Palestinians. He confesses that there are 700,000 Arabs who live in Palestine, of course, including 33,000 Jews who lived in Palestine, but he doesn't care about consulting them about something related to their destiny. And just here an example to show how this theology originated or developed over history. Here we need to go to dispensationalism, which developed in the 19th century by Irish lawyer and theologian John Nelson Darby, which divides the history into 7 dispensations, gives Israel 6 of them and the church only 1. And the church seems to be for him as a parenthesis to Israel. So for dispensationalism, there is Israel and there is the church. Israel has the laws, the Israelites as the earthly people of God, and earthly kingdom of David and the land, while the church is saved by the grace of Christ, the church as an institution that will go or be raptured later into heaven. And here we see that the whole Zionist movement or dispensationalism focused on sending back the Jews to Palestine in order for the end times to come. So we see that the Zionist movement continued to have an influence, of course, on the project of colonizing Palestine. So I would here also refer to Ben White's book, the British journalist, Israeli Apartheid, who talks about how the Zionist, and I would say also Christian Zionist, view of Palestine as an empty or land without people, but not literally, but in terms of people of equal worth of the incoming settlers. And here we are talking about European Jews. How that attitude impacted Palestinian Christians. And here I would refer to Eric Bishop, who was an Anglican missionaries of Tiberias and Lebanon, who in 1940s wrote back to his government and his mission agency that Palestinians feel that they have been betrayed by the Christian West. And in fact, it saddens me to say that it's still until today the same. My second point is political and religious power and control, which leads to dehumanization, delegitimization, silencing, and dehumanization of Palestinian. Edward Said in Orientalism, 1978, talks about controlling knowledge and the narrative for power. Who has the narrative, who has the power? And we see that Israel and Christian Zionists controlled the narrative for so long by silencing, delegitimizing, and dehumanizing the Palestinians. And here I want to come to Christian Zionists, as after 1948, when the occupation is realized and the state of Israel was created, we see a rise of a new movement among Christians. And this is what we call Christian Zionists, and here you could see one example of them. One of their major leaders, John Hagee, pastor of a megachurch in Texas. So Christian Zionists or Zionism is an extension actually of colonial ideology, is an international movement among Christians and churches to support the modern state of Israel as a national homeland of the Jewish people, based on certain interpretation of promises and prophecies from the Bible. Of course, we see how theology is influencing politics, and you could see this actually impacting the American and Western politics. So John Hagee, for example, these only few examples, always connects the history of America to the history of Israel. So the day America turns in back, as Hagee says, its back on Israel, is the day God will turn his back on America, connecting religion into politics to support colonial project. And of course, that extends to the apocalyptic fantasy, the way to Armageddon, in order to bring about the return or the second return of Christ. And we see this even within the White House. You see here how Michael Pompeo, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, have even impact on the foreign policies on Palestine, of course impacted by many literature written in the West, like the series on the rapture left behind, which is of course impacted by dispensationalism. I want to go fast in that, but you could see clearly that many Christians in the West are claiming to support Israel based on the Bible, which now making the Bible the problem. And seems that Palestinians are standing against and in hindrance of God's plan to bring back the Jewish people to their land. And I think this is controversial, even I would say it's unbiblical at some point, because we could refute easily dispensationalism and Christian Zionist biblical claims through Christ-centered theology. So these are just a few statistics to show how even Christians in the West are supporting Israel based on biblical interpretation and justifications of occupation, while at the same time neglecting the Palestinians' rights of existence in this land. While Americans or Western Christians usually about 76% support Israeli claim for statehood, 46% are denying Palestinians' right for statehood. Not only that, but they are also supporting with millions of dollars evangelical Christians around the world to as investments in the Israeli settlements, army, and the wall. Actually, Western support of the occupation has been a hindrance for peace process and also a burden for us as Palestinians, because it has an adverse impact on us. And of course, we see that Israel has been supported by Christians to pass the nation state law, which is very racist law that elevates Jewish people over any other people in the country. So the delegitimization here is not only the denial of the Palestinian history and reality of life under occupation, but as Jack in his presentation 2016 brings 4 points. Palestinians, when they speak, usually accused of anti-Semitism, and I don't know how it's possible, because we are Semites, you know, and we are accused of being replacement theologians, while we are actually, we could say that we are Christ-centered theologians. We are kingdom-oriented people who want to see peace. We want to see the kingdom of God fully present in our land. We are usually being accused of terrorism supporters and Chrislam as a form of Christianity and Islam. But it goes further, not only to delegitimize us, but also to silence Palestinians. And here I would like to encourage people who watch this presentation to read Munzer Isaac, Palestinian theologian and pastor book, The Other Side of the Wall, which explains and represents actually many Palestinians, how we were silenced by other Christians in the West. So what's that impacts on Palestinian Christians? And here I come to dehumanization. And what you see here is a picture from Banksy Hotel, the Waldorf in Bethlehem, shows you how the numbers of Palestinians are killed by Israelis compared to Israelis killed by Palestinians. I don't mean that the life of Israelis are not valued, but here it's a comparison, that how Palestinians' life are less value for the international community. Then when one rocket goes out of Gaza and Israel hits 100 rockets, what we see only in the news, Fox News and other platforms and outlets, is only about the one rocket that went out of Gaza. There is systematic dehumanization of Palestinians and showing them as evil, as terrorists. And of course, you see what happened in Gaza after 2005-2006 election, when Palestinian elected democratically Hamas to be in the parliament, the Palestinian parliament. The whole world stood against the Palestinians. So Palestinian people in Gaza and in the West Bank are paying for their right to practice democracy, because Israel and America, they didn't like what the Palestinians have chosen. Imagine that when you elected Trump, the whole world would come and accuse Americans for electing Trump or something like that, for being or practicing democracy. You're being accused and punished. And these are just few statistics to show you how horrific is the situation in Gaza. 45% of unemployment and 95% of the water is undrinkable. Lastly, how that impact, and of course, how all of it brings it up to the Christian community in Palestine. The Palestinian Christian community has been in constant decline. Nowadays, Palestinian Christians are only 1%, and already 36% of the Palestinians are considering immigration because of the occupation and the economic hardship. And you can see that the recent plan of annexation is actually takes away any hopes for peace and for a future. And here I will end with a quote of Michel Sabah, the former patriarch of the Latin Church in Jerusalem. He said, "We have reached the moment of impossible." I understand where he comes from as we see the situation and the reality around us, but at the same time, I believe that our God is the God of impossible, and as a church, we have responsibility to be peacemakers. And here I would like to end my presentation. Thank you to Himir.
And thank you very much, Yusuf. You really made me think. I might come later with a question or two. And now, from talking about external problems from without, let's move to some challenges that exist from within, internal challenges. And Lama, I would like you to share some of those challenges are. Please, welcome.
Yes, hi, good evening. It's a joy to be with you all tonight, and I'm looking forward to our conversations later and discussing some of these points that you have risen, all of you. I'll share my screen. Yes, so I'll briefly discuss many of these points have already been mentioned by the previous presentations, but I'll briefly discuss some of the challenges that Palestinians face today. And it's important that these challenges differ according to the location and the legal status of Palestinians. So I'll be addressing the challenges of Palestinians in Israel and the challenges of Palestinians in the West Bank. I unfortunately do not have the time to also address the challenges that Palestinians in Gaza face, or Palestinians, international Palestinians, not international, maybe we can cut this out, Palestinians in diaspora face, or those of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, living in East Jerusalem. So first, Palestinians in Israel. These are Palestinians who in 1948 remained in their homes and were given Israeli citizenship and now are Israeli citizens. They comprise about 21% of the Israeli population. And the main challenge that they face are inequalities. Formally, we are full citizens. I'm a Palestinian who has an Israeli citizenship. So formally we are full citizens, but our conditions, our social, economic, health conditions are some of the worst in the country. Socioeconomically, half of Palestinian families in Israel live under the poverty line. Our employment rates are lower than Jewish citizens, significantly lower than Jewish citizens, and the percentage of Palestinian Israeli academic degree holders is half of that of Jewish citizens. Health inequalities persist. The gap in life expectancy between Jewish and Palestinian citizens has been well documented for years. Also in terms of education, as I previously mentioned. And an important legislation in Palestinian Israelis' status as citizens in Israel is the nation-state law. This law was enacted in July 2018, so 2 years ago. And I unfortunately don't have the time to dissect the entire law here. But in general, it declared Israel as being a Jewish nation. And Israel has been long declared as both Jewish and democratic, and this law certainly tips the scale towards its Jewishness. It grants the right of self-determination exclusively to Jewish citizens, and it revokes the status of Arabic as an official language of the state, which is the language that Palestinian citizens speak in the country. And it serves to emphasize the inferior status of Palestinians, of us, Palestinian citizens of the country, and promote Jewish superiority in the land. And as it is a constitutional law, it's not an ordinary law. It overrides other laws and it serves to interpret them. And we have yet to see the full impact of this law. As for Palestinians living in the West Bank under Palestinian Authority and under direct occupation, they face the direct occupation of the State of Israel. This means that as we've heard, their freedom of movement is severely restricted. They need special permits to move in and out of the West Bank, and as we've heard before, even within the West Bank, with heavily militarized checkpoints between Palestinian towns and villages. As we've also heard, as Arish said, Israel controls the access to natural resources and therefore also controls the economy of Palestine. Actually, some studies suggest that the Palestinian economy could be twice its current size had the occupation not occurred. Of course, the continued building of illegal settlements and confiscation of Palestinian land, these are all challenges that Palestinians in the West Bank face. The disproportionate use of force. Yeah, so you can go and maybe read about the story of Ahmed Arakat, who was shot by Israeli Jewish soldiers on his way from one Palestinian town to another. He was passing, and the disproportionate use of power is just staggering in that specific story. And of course, all this control leads to the Palestinians having limited governing power over their own supposedly own territory. And Yusuf touched briefly upon this, is the issue of immigration. There's a great desire to immigrate, especially among Christian Palestinians. As was previously mentioned, the desire to immigrate among Palestinian Christians is almost twice as much as that of Muslims. So 36, which is almost twice as much as Muslims. And this is due to economical reasons, domestic conditions such as corruption and safety, and just better educational opportunities usually abroad due to the current situation. And I'd like to briefly also touch upon societal challenges, which are indirectly impacted by the occupation and by what's happening politically, but these are also societal challenges that we ourselves have to reckon with and work through. First is the issue of violence between families. This is a huge issue especially for Palestinians in Israel. Illegal weapons and shootings every few days. We hear about a shooting here or there. And this is partly due to inadequate policing and inadequate promotion of safety in these villages and towns, and just blatant state neglect of safety in Palestinian towns within Israel itself. And also gender-based violence. Violence against women has been prevalent, especially during the pandemic. It has risen quite extensively and very fast. And we can't say this is because of the frustration of the political situation, but this is also something that we need to think about and reckon with and work towards doing better in these places. And also corruption on a government level, on a national level. At the moment, Bibi Netanyahu, our prime minister, is currently on trial for charges of accepting bribes and fraud. So this is not a small issue. But also in terms of municipalities on a local government scale, the corruption is unfortunately very prevalent with nepotism, with discrimination between certain people, other people, mismanagement of public funds, and so on. So these are some of the societal challenges that both Palestinians in Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank are currently also dealing with and facing internally, not just externally.
Thank you, Lama, for sharing with us some of the most important internal challenges. And now we are moving to one more question that we have for today. And I would like Jack to speak about this question. And the question is about current developments. We know that all of us globally have been affected by the corona pandemic. And I know that you have been also in some unique ways too. So maybe this would be a moment to talk about this too. And also about some of the other current challenges. So please, welcome, Jack.
Thank you. My presentation today is going to build on both Lama and Yusuf's talk, especially because both the list of issues that they have raised are ongoing challenges that we are facing, so they are current developments. However, there are two main issues which are going to be major game changers for the Palestinian Christian community. One is the challenge of coronavirus, which everyone around the world is facing, but I'd like to focus very briefly on some of the other ways that it impacts Palestinian Christians, both in Israel and in the West Bank. So if we look at the coronavirus in Israel, we have, as of this week, 56,000 cases and 433 deaths so far, which is fairly high on the per capita list. So we face many of the same restrictions that everyone else in the world does, of work, of movement, a health crisis in many countries. But on top of that, we also have widening gaps between the Jewish and Palestinian citizens, which Lama has already explained is quite significant. So just to give you one example, the Palestinian municipalities received only 2% of the state aid for the local authorities, when the Palestinian population in Israel is 20% of the population. So this continues to exacerbate the already difficult situation that Palestinians in Israel are facing. They are also therefore on the receiving end of higher rates of depression, stress, and anxiety. For Palestinians in the West Bank, we have around 11,000 cases and 67 deaths so far. It has completely crippled the Palestinian economy, which is already restricted, again, as Lama's pointed out, by the occupation. The Palestinian infrastructure is simply not able to handle this pandemic, which has created a big panic. The occupation restricts Palestinians to highly dense areas. So for example, when you look at Asia's maps, you can see that Palestinians are almost put on islands and have limited access to other territory, which means when the virus does spread inside a community, it spreads fast and it spreads wide. So this is a major game changer, which is not only affecting the Palestinian population, but Palestinian Christians specifically. The second thing, which is going to be a major game changer when it comes to the conflict here, is the so-called Trump deal of the century, which is allegedly supposed to support peace. But actually it has triggered a unilateral step by the state of Israel called annexation. And when we use the term annexation, what do we mean? Annexation is a formal act whereby a state proclaims its sovereignty over a territory that's outside its domain. Another way of putting it is annexation is an occupation gone wrong. So a historical example of an occupation, Morocco occupied Western Sahara on the west of Africa and eventually annexed it into Morocco and is considered Morocco today. This is illegal under international law. Almost every form of annexation is illegal. This is more or less what was supposed to be proposed as the two-state solution. We had a Palestinian state in orange and an Israeli state in green. However, this annexation plan sort of is not so new to many Palestinian Christians. And the reason being is that annexation has already been going on for many years. This has happened through the settlements, which again were mentioned by previous speakers. Settlements will typically begin like this, on top of a hill, and will spread further and further down on Palestinian land within the West Bank. This creates huge inequalities. It creates massive difficulties for Palestinians. So on the picture that you can see, this is the separation wall between settlers and between Palestinians within the West Bank. On the left-hand side, you have an Israeli-only road that only settlers can use. And on the right-hand side, you can see the Palestinian wall, which is severely, the Palestinian road, which is severely affected by the wall. In this map here, you can see the spread of settlements throughout all of the West Bank, which means the two-state solution has already had a massive challenge of not being viable due to the massive amounts of settlements. Now, if you include annexation into this, it really harms the prospect of a two-state solution. This is the annexation map as it has been proposed to take place. This area on the right-hand side here is the Jordan Valley, and all this will become Israel proper, as well as many of these dark blue settlements that you can see spotted across the West Bank. It will leave Palestinians living in, as I mentioned before, islands, territory, without much access to each other and the outside world. And so Jericho here will become an island in the middle of new Israeli territory. Now, the community in the Jordan Valley is particularly vulnerable. They have faced massive amounts of demolitions and confiscations over the year. Since January of 2020, 150 people have been made homeless due to demolitions and confiscations. We even had the destruction of a medical tent, which was supposed to serve people in emergency situations. Many of the people living in the Jordan Valley are very rural and far away from medical assistance. And so this was completely confiscated and destroyed by the Israeli military. And this week, on Tuesday, there was also a coronavirus center which was destroyed in Hebron. So this has further exacerbated the situation in Palestine. The third thing is that there's settler harassment. Settlers will come and harass Palestinian shepherds and Palestinian agriculture workers with the support of the Israeli military. We are expecting all three of these things to increase if an annexation moves forward. So what's the impact? Well, close to around a third of the West Bank is going to be lost to Palestinians and incorporated into Israel. We're going to see a loss of natural resources and fertile land, particularly for agriculture and water resources. We're seeing potentially the displacement of 50,000 Palestinians, where we don't know what's going to happen to them. Are they going to be incorporated into Israel? Israel has said that that's not going to be the case. So what's going to happen to them? Are they going to be kicked out? Are they going to leave? It's not clear. Most importantly, it also cuts off Palestinians from Jordan. And this is the only way that Palestinians can access the outside world, through international travel. And it completely isolates Jericho from the rest of the West Bank. So the impact here is quite severe. The thing that will impact very much Palestinian Christians is how we view peace. So the impact of annexation means that basically the two-state solution is gone. there are no more two states to negotiate over. There's sort of one state that controls most of the territory and a group of people that live in isolated areas. 61% of Palestinian Christians in the West Bank are now saying that they are supportive of a one-state solution, as of a poll that was made in 2020. 84% are worried of settlers or Israeli forces harassment, and a second Nakba, which, if you will remember from Arij's presentation, is a catastrophe. So basically, both the COVID-19 situation and the annexation is pushing Palestinian Christians to think that maybe we need to fight for our rights rather than fight for a state, but it's also eliminating the prospect of peace for the next few generations. And so these are the current developments that if anyone has even a small interest in what happens here in the Middle East, and particularly in the Holy Land, should be taking note of and should be acting against in order to support a peaceful solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques, for your very informative and very rich presentation about the most important current challenges that you are facing, Palestinians and Christian Palestinians in Palestine and Israel. And thank you also, all of you, each one of you, for your presentations. Amazing, amazing presentations that are leading me to a few questions that I have for you, if this is all right with you. And first question would go something like this. To give us a little bit of illustration of the Christian presence in Palestine. I know that there are different churches, different denominations, and I know it's not something from yesterday. So could you feel free, whoever would like to do this, feel free to share a little bit about the presence of Christianity in Palestine. Who would like to do that?
I can try. You know, Palestinian Christians is part of the surprise that many Western Christians ask us is that, oh, when did you convert? So if you can trace back or Christians in the Holy Land, even in Scripture, in Pentecost, there's a description there that Arabs actually were among those who received the Holy Spirit. And throughout the different empires, Christians remained in the Holy Land, and many of us can trace back our heritage to a certain tribe or parts of the Middle East. And as you know, that area was always a mixture of peoples. But today, I mean, one, because it's the Holy Land, but also of history, the majority of Christians are both Eastern and Western. So the majority are Greek Orthodox and Eastern Catholic. There's smaller numbers of Roman Catholic, Armenian Orthodox, Copt, Episcopalian, Ethiopian Orthodox, Greek Catholic, Lutheran, Maronite, and of course from the Protestant, there are also evangelicals in different streams that many of us are aware of.
If I could just add to this,
yes,
Palestinian
please.
Christians have been a significant part of the development of the land as well. Not only custodians of the holy sites, and seeing themselves almost as the fifth gospel, which is here to continue and share the story that Jesus Christ was here, he lived, he taught, he healed. Palestinian Christians see themselves as carrying on this tradition, but also in developing Palestinian society in itself. When you see the Palestinian national movement being developed towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Palestinian Christians were at the heart of building a fair and equal Palestinian society. And so Palestinian Christians, although numerically are very small, have a huge impact and play a huge role when it comes to anything that happens here in this land.
I'm also aware of a different, whether we call them ministries, organizations, initiatives, which are organized, established by Palestinian Christians in Palestine and Israel. Can you share some of practical examples of those activisms in the fields of reconciliation and peace building, or any other activism that is building up the community, and maybe that you are involved in and with?
I can start. I mean, as I was saying, there are different types of social justice and peacemaking groups, and I myself have worked for many years in Musalaha, and it's a faith-based organization that promotes reconciliation, and it's still ongoing now, and many of the panelists are either familiar or have participated in it as well. There's also a biannual conference called Christ at the Checkpoint, and it's held in Bethlehem, organized by the Bethlehem Bible College, where they bring together different theologians and think tanks within the Christian discourse to talk about the situation and how should we as Christians respond to the context. Personally, you know, I am also involved in writing as well as my panelists. I mean, writing and statements are very common. You can see a lot of different statements written about the annexation recently and any events that happen. That's a very strong form of activism that the leadership does. And on the in terms of social justice as well, I think it's important to realize that we want to also elevate the voices of those on the margins. And one example that I will also put in the resource list is a podcast called Women Behind the Wall, and it's a beautiful attempt to tell stories of Palestinian Christian women sharing their experiences of what it's like to live on the other side of the wall, and how do they intersect their faith and their gender and the conflict itself. It's a good starting point if you want to get to know and get to have as kind of a point of reference to know more about some of the events that we talked about in the situation. I'll leave it open. I'm sure my colleagues also have a lot of personal social activism that they can talk about.
Just I want to add a point here, because many times when we speak to Western groups, they ask us, what's the solution, you know, how we could achieve peace and reconciliation, which makes reconciliation as an end goal, not recognizing that it's a process. And in order to get to the point where we can develop a reconciliation, justice has to be served, and the oppression has to be recognized and repented on. So as part of the reconciliation process, I consider advocating for the Palestinian rights is essential, right? So what we are doing, and I'm really appreciative of your initiative, is to raise the voice of Palestinians, to share their stories, to share what's happening here, because unless if we're not invited to the table with whom you are pursuing reconciliation, right? Because reconciliation happens between two parties, and with keeping the Palestinians neglected, silenced, I think reconciliation is unattainable.
Thank you very much. Yes,
I have another example. For the past 2 years, I've been helping lead the Divided Cities initiative, where we take Palestinians from East Jerusalem and Israeli Jews from West Jerusalem, and we go to conflict cities and contexts like Belfast, like Nicosia, other divided cities. And we try and learn lessons from these other countries, some of which have managed to find peace and some of which haven't. And so we've tried to come together as Israelis and Palestinians and to learn lessons from these people and apply it in our own city and in our own context. So this is another example of a peace initiative that Palestinian Christians like myself and others have been involved in.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who would like to share also your personal, please?
I would like to add my own personal experience in, I work as a research consultant with Northumbria University, and part of what we do, I feel is very important because I go and meet with Palestinians who are in the villages, who their voices haven't been heard before and haven't been asked questions about their living situation and about what they actually think. So I don't just meet with other organizations, I meet with people of the community, of the society one-on-one, and I hear their stories, their challenges. I ask them tough questions. I build relationship with them, I get to know them, and I break any cultural barrier with the British university, which brings out genuine answers and builds a very strong research. The research results aren't out yet, but at least we're building something that's very genuine and coming out from the people, and not only from reports from other organizations or formal reports, more like one-on-one conversations and relationships.
I can briefly say I've been mainly working with students in higher education, and there's been an explosion in Palestinian students writing about their own context because they've been, a bit fed up with other people coming in and writing about their own contexts. So I see it as a sort of activism to bring Palestine into academic discourse and show a different perspective on it. I've been involved in that work myself, of writing about depopulated Palestinian villages, but just most Palestinian students are writing about their own context, and that was unheard of a few years ago.
Thank you, Lama. This demonstrates that all of you are very much actively involved in different kinds of activities that either have to do with peace building, reconciliation, or some other form of actually building up your communities. I would now like to go to the next question. Yusuf, when you were sharing your presentation about the external challenges, immediately my mind went to a question about all of you must have had experiences where you personally experience actually what does it look like, this prejudice that comes from Christians from abroad. What does it look like in your own setting? I would like us to share some of those with us.
Thank you, Tahmir. I did my graduate studies in the United States, in particular in the Northeast, and I had multiple chances to share my story in churches. And I felt it and experienced it firsthand, that being rejected, being silenced, being even questioned, if what I'm saying is true. Although I have many evidence, and I'm myself the evidence of what a Palestinian life under occupation could be. But recently, about last year, I had a group at Bethlehem Bible College from Germany that came to listen to Palestinian Christian story. And when I started sharing my narrative, and it was less tense than what I presented here even, they started interrupting and opposing my story. And some of them left the room. They didn't want to listen. And I think this is the major issue, and that's why I started with controlling the narrative, because when those Western Christians not only want to keep what they already have learned, but they don't want to listen, and they don't want to give us a chance to speak about our own stories and real life experiences, if it doesn't fit their expectations or what they have learned throughout their life.
Yeah, I just want to say I've personally had this experience, and I wrote about it. And actually, I didn't expect the reaction to get, but if you, I attended a conference. I attended a concert that when Hillsong came to Israel, and I wrote about that experience. So if you want to read more about it, you can Google my name and just put Hillsong. And it was very hurtful. I think to be rejected by people who you assumed they were going to welcome you and accept you for who you are, and the result of it is, I really hope no one feels these rejections like some of us have experienced. And it's hard to kind of keep going, when you experience that. But just an example, we can read further, there was a correspondence with Hillsong about it as well.
Thank you. Arish?
I've personally had so many experiences, but I'll give at least two of the most memorable ones that I experienced and had like a big effect on my life. Once I was in a Christian conference setting with actually with Israelis and Palestinians, and then I was denied my culture. I had like no representation of who I am. I was not welcomed as a Palestinian Christian. I was not welcomed as a Palestinian, like, let alone. But then, like, when I asked if I can show something from my culture, since everyone else did, they were insulted because I shouldn't say or speak up or ask for a cultural experience, even though everyone had the same experience. So was asking a very fair request, but then it turned into a big deal, and they were offended because I'm not the one coordinating for the conference. They're the ones coordinating for it, and they should be taking the lead on this. So that was an example of one of the examples of how hurtful when Christians who should be treating you as the same body of Christ, as equal to everyone else, but still treat you differently because of your nationality and because who you are. But the second time I've been exposed to something like this was someone asking me, when I shared my challenges and what I'm going through as a Palestinian living here, they asked me, why don't you leave? Even though that might have been a very innocent question, but I felt this was like an explosive question to me. It's like, how can you not understand the connection of the Palestinian people with the land? How can you not be more compassionate to what I'm going through and seek justice? Because as Christians, we need to be peacemakers on this land. We need to force change and ask for change, not escape it and find easy solutions just because they're making history more complicated. No, we need to find rooted answers. And I felt after we had this discussion, they actually understood what I was talking about, but still, like this question challenged my Christianity, challenged me, because it helped me view people's perspective on a very heavy topic or a very heavy reality I'm going through, but yet like they take it very easily, some people, and try to minimize the effect of it and just find easy solutions for it. I'll leave it to here. I don't want to go into too many details and too many examples.
I had a similar experience to Arish. The first time I left this country to leave home and live somewhere else, I met an American from Colorado who was so excited to meet someone who comes from Jerusalem. When I told him I was Palestinian, he was shocked. He took a step backwards and he said, why don't you leave? You are delaying the second coming of Jesus. And if you just left your home and made place for other Jews to come and live in Jerusalem, Jesus would be coming faster. And this type of response that you get from someone who in theory believes the same thing you do, who is supposed to share the same biblical values that you do, and not only to be rejected but to be insulted like that, is really sort of stays with you, that experience. And I completely understand what Arish is saying when she says that you feel like there's no place for your identity in this narrative that has been constructed.
Yeah, I can just jump off of that. It's bittersweet to listen to these experiences, to know that all of us have kind of gone through many of the same things, but it's sad at the same time. I was in the States the first time I left home as well to go live somewhere else. And someone had told, and I was volunteering at a church, and someone had told this man that I'd come from Israel. That was the introduction at the time. And he came and he started talking to me without me even introducing myself. And he said, "Oh, I heard you're from Israel. We pray for you every time. We bless Israel all of the time. Don't let those Palestinians take an inch of what God promised for you." And I was kind of taken aback. I was an 18-year-old girl, and I said, but I'm Palestinian. And he was in shock. He didn't know what to say, and I just left. But there's this denial of who you are, of, you know, being treated as filthy, as you should leave. And so yeah, I guess it just ties into what everyone else was saying, this kind of shared experience that we face from mainly Westerners.
So thank you, my friends. This has been eye-opening for me and really powerful to hear from you so much about the challenges that you as Christians are facing, you Palestinian Christians in Palestine and Israel are facing. And time is telling us that we are now coming to the end of this visual gathering of friends together. And that means that we need to bring it to closure. So what I would like to ask you to do is that each one of you take a couple of minutes and share your final thoughts, maybe some hope, maybe some encouragement, and maybe, yes, encouragement for the people, Christians in the West. And what are your dreams, maybe, as we are moving forward as Christians in the world and you as Christians in Palestine. So I would simply advise that we go in the same order without me recognizing you individually, in the same order as you have spoken at the beginning. So please, you are welcome.
My last words would be for this webinar is that, like, I know people go to history sometimes and go to the order of how things have happened to try to make it easier for them to take a side, or try to make it easier for them to decide on which party I want to be with. Do I want to be with pro-Israel or pro-Palestine? But I would like to recommend people to, like, have a different aspect to how things are going on here in this land. How people are living right now, how people are going through daily lives today. We are living still, even among all of those challenges that we have mentioned. Life is still going on. People are people. Humanize the people behind the stories. But you can't do that without hearing our narrative, meeting the people, getting involved and getting active in purposefully getting to understand what's actually going on. And in that way, you would understand that it's not as easy as, like, let me take a side based on 1, 2, 3 facts, but it's more about, like, what's right and wrong and what's just and unjust, and how can we fix this and move forward and not be stuck in the present. Patriarch Sabah have said that we have reached a time of the impossible, and indeed it is impossible right now with the facts, but it's not impossible when people are involved and trying to make a difference and trying to challenge what's actually happening.
So what is my hope? This is a question I always grapple with. I'm still trying to put my finger on the root cause of that, but I always wonder why I am asked this question. What is your hope for me? There's something in the discourse of hope that bothers me. Perhaps this session was too much for you, or you feel discomfort, heavy, despaired. I would encourage you to really sit with the discomfort. Instead of covering it, instead of covering all this discomfort with a blanket of hope, deal with the feelings you are experiencing right now, and tell me, what is your message of hope for us? I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And let this discomfort push you to ask questions. Who is not in the conversations and why? What other voices might you not be hearing? The Christian Palestinian, Muslim Palestinians, women's voices. What can you do to give us hope? Will you give us bottles of water, or will you help us get running water every day of the week? What is your realm of influence? Take part in making peace a bottom-up approach, reflecting what the people want. So to be honest, some days I am hopeful, and some days I'm not. As I said, it's an ongoing struggle. But an answer I can give you right now is that despite all of these challenges we are going through, we are still here and our voices are being heard. This gives me hope.
I think it's very important to be authentic at this point. How I could offer a message of hope while I'm struggling with this, as Shadia said. Sometimes I feel like in despair because around me the situation seems hopeless. But at the same time, I believe in our calling as Christians to be peacemakers, ambassadors of reconciliation, which gives me hope that as Christian community in Palestine, we are the vehicles of God to bring hope for people. I'm just reminded of Mitra Rahib, Palestinian theologian, once pointed that hope is faith in action. Hope is faith in action. And the hope that we could deliver is the faith that as a Christian community in Palestine, we are the salt and light for this land. And my invitation for international Christians around the world, just to welcome us on the table. Because many times when we try to sit on the table, we feel like everyone else moves on and they don't want to have us there. They don't want to talk the hard talk with us about our struggles and challenges. And here I appreciate how Shadia talked about the discomfort. It's okay to feel discomfort with challenges. That's how we grow. And I think as Palestinians, we have listened for so long, for about 70 years, and we should be allowed to speak. And when we could come into dialogue as equal brothers and sisters in Christ, we could arrive at some point to what could be a possibility for peace and reconciliation. At last, I would like to remind everyone that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, a male or female, a slave or free, and these divisions are man-made, while the God-given identity for all of us that we are sons and daughters of God, and that we should respect and love and honor each other, that was created in the image of God. So when we silence each other, when we ignore each other, it's a disrespect to the God-given purpose to humanity. My message of hope is to have faith in action. Faith in actions means that let's do it. Let's challenge each other. Let's talk the hard talks. Let's walk the hard walk. And that's how we could actually live out our calling as the disciples of Christ. Let's be kingdom people, kingdom-oriented people, where we see the potential of the kingdom of God in Palestine to be a kingdom of justice and peace and love.
We've heard about many challenges and many difficulties in a lot of the presentations and the questions that we've heard. But in these challenges lie great opportunities, and they cultivate great resilience in each and every one of us. And I think if you talk to any Palestinian, you can recognize that resilience, that deep connection to the land, to the people, to justice, and the fact that we're still here, and not only still here, but thriving, getting more and more educated. You know, Christian Palestinian women in Israel are the most educated group in all of the country. This is great news. The next generation is becoming more and more educated and has strong equipment, strong tools to deal with this very challenging context. So we're not wallowing in self-pity. We recognize the challenges, we recognize the difficulties, but there's no time for self-pity. We're moving, we talk about our challenges, but we do it while we're acting, while we're making change and making a difference. And God gave us this identity. We're not running from it. God gave us the privilege, the honor, the duty, the burden, maybe sometimes, of living in this land and of this strange, complex, challenging identity. And we're not running away from it, and we're moving on. So this gives me hope. This gives me hope that we're still moving, we're still here, we're thriving. When given an opportunity, we not only succeed but thrive. And yeah, I think I'll stop there.
I also struggle to find hope in this situation, but a place that I've rediscovered hope is actually with my colleagues here on this panel and other Palestinian Christians that are sharing the same passion that I have for this issue, that are standing up to the human rights violations that we see, that are speaking out about the situation. And it is because of the solidarity that we have together that I'm rediscovering hope. Every single one of the people here on this call today could have excellent excuses not to speak out and not to face the type of consequences that you do when you speak out about such a sensitive subject. But everyone's speaking out, everyone's speaking truth to power, everyone's trying to push the message forward, even if there's a cost to that. And that helps me find hope. And I think for you, the audience listening to this, we've done our part. We've educated ourselves about the situation. We've tried to build and frame a message so that you can hear our voices. The rest is up to you to find out what it is that you need to do in your context so that you can support us in this difficult situation. And so, again, the 5 people here and others that are engaging and advocating and trying to have a voice of biblical justice and peace in what is a crazy situation need the support of the global church.
Thank you, Jack, Lama, Shadia, Arish, Yusuf, for being so vulnerable and willing to share your challenges. The challenges that you as Palestinian Christians in Israel and Palestine are facing every day. Friends, you who have been faithfully listening to us and watching for the past 90 minutes and so, we said at the beginning that this was going to be a challenging time for some of us, or inspiring just as well. Whatever the case, let us know. Our email address is provided here at the screen. Our panelists would be willing, more than willing, to answer some of your additional questions that might be forthcoming over the days ahead of us. We might have a follow-up conversation that would address your questions. Meanwhile, till we meet again, I'm Tihomir Kukoja, the producer and editor of Face-to-Face Conversation. Many blessings. Till we meet again.